Okay, so let's now implement the feature of updating recipe servings. And this time we're actually starting in the controller just so we can outline what we want to happen. So let's come down here and add yet another controller. So control servings, let's say. And I keep calling these functions here controllers, but that's just because we're using the model view controller pattern. So they could also be called handlers because in the end, that's what they are. They are simply event handlers that will run whenever some event happens. Now in this case, this controller here will eventually be executed when the user clicks on one of these buttons here. So either to decrease or to increase the servings. And so that will then increase or decrease this number here and also adjust all of these ingredients, right? So this controller is actually going to be very simple. All we have to do here is to update the recipe servings, so in the state, so basically updating the underlying data. And then all we have to do is to update the view as well. So actually updating the recipe view, because that is of course the view that will be impacted by controlling these servings, right? So in this case, we will actually have no like servings view because these buttons and everything that happens when we click on them is already in the recipe view. All right. So here, updating the servings in the state has of course to do with the model. And so in the model, we would like to have some method which does that for us. So as always, we will not want to manipulate data directly here in the controller. Instead, we delegate that task to the model, which is all about the data. So again, in the model, we will like to have a method called update servings, and then we can pass in the new servings. So let's just say 6 here for experimenting. And so let's now go to the model and actually implement this. So load recipe, then results, and here we will have the update servings function. And so this will then take in the number of servings. Let's call it new servings, actually. Now what this function will do is to reach into the state, and in particular into the recipe ingredients, and then change the quantity in each ingredient. So we have state.recipe, and then we have that ingredients array. Ingredients. And so again, in each ingredient, we now want to change the quantity property. So just to remember again our data, because I know this can be quite confusing, let's do a search here, because that will then change us, or actually it will show us here some real data. So here is a recipe. This is actually only the search data, but this is the actual data here. So for the entire recipe. And so remember that we have the ingredients in there, and each ingredient is an object which contains the quantity. And so this is the quantity we want to change. For example, here this quantity 2 is for 4 servings. But if we had 8 servings, then the quantity should become 8, right? So the servings doubled, and so the quantity needs to double as well. And so that's the kind of logic that we will write now. And so, yeah, this was just to show you that it is the quantity property inside of the ingredient that we will want to mutate. So we want to do something for each of these ingredients. So we don't want a new array. And we could do that also. So we could create a new array and then override state.recipe, but let's just do it like this. So basically with side effects. So in each iteration of the loop, we have the current ingredient, and then here we want to do something with it. So basically we want to change it. So ingredient dot quantity should become something new. And now how do we calculate this new quantity? Well, we will basically use this formula. So let me write that here. So new quantity equals the old quantity times the new servings divided by the old servings. And let's use the example that I mentioned earlier. So changing from 4 servings to 8 servings. And I think we had the quantity of 2. So 2 times, and then the new servings again were 8 divided by 4. And so this would then be 8 divided by 4 is 2, times 2 is 4. So again, if we double the servings like this, then we also need to double the quantity. So we then multiply the original quantity by this ratio here, basically. Okay, so just basic mathematics here. And so let's not put this formula here. So the old quantity is in this case also ingredients dot quantity, so the original one, and then times the new servings, so the one we are getting here, divided by state dot recipe dot servings. Okay. So with this, we are changing all the ingredients. And now to finish, of course, we also need to update the servings in the state. Because otherwise, if we tried to update the servings twice, then by the second time, we would still be using the old value of the servings. And so, of course, we need to update this value. So state.recipe.servings needs to be the new servings. And we're doing that here at the end of the function because otherwise we could not preserve this old, so this original value here. Okay. So with this, we update the servings of the current recipe. And again, that works because we already have the recipe in the state. Okay. And so then we need to simply update the recipe view. And by now, what we will do is to actually simply overwrite the complete recipe. So basically, we will simply render it again. So exactly what we had here actually in control recipes. So taking the recipe out of the state and then simply rendering it. So let's copy this down here. So we do that because we don't want to manually go ahead and change all of these values here one by one. So we would have to select this element and this one, and then manually change all of that. And the same here for this value, right? And so we don't want to have all of that work. And so for now, we will simply, update this entire element here again. So this entire view. Okay. And now let's actually call this controller here without having to create the event listener just yet. So just to test if everything is working. And so let's do that after all of this. So here in the init function at the end, we call control servings. And so with this, we can guarantee that there is already a recipe loaded. So let's actually use the example of 8 here so that we double the values. And well, that's not really working. There seems to be some kind of bug here. Oh, and for each is of course wrong here, but we also have some other problem here apparently. which is that we are trying to read for each on undefined. So let's first fix that small error. So it's called for each. And then that other problem actually comes from the fact that we are doing it wrong. So we are not taking into account the asynchronous nature of our application here. So basically here we are trying to control the servings simply after registering these handler functions here. But by that time, no recipe has yet arrived from the API. And so therefore, state.recipe is not yet defined. And so here we are then trying to read ingredients from the recipe that doesn't exist. Okay, does that make sense? And this is actually a great demonstration of the pitfalls of working with asynchronous JavaScript. So if we really wanted to test this here right now, we could probably do that right here after we control the recipes. So basically after the recipe is loaded. So let's just temporarily put this here, or probably even better, right here. Let's just mark this very clearly as a test. All right, and let's see what happens now. Oh, and now we have the 8 servings that we want. And here these values, they should have changed. Well, I'm not sure what they looked like before, but we can reach here. Oh, but here we also already have the 8 servings. So this is not a good comparison, but let's try it here with 4. And so we have 4, and yeah, these values are actually half of what they were before. And so that means that our update servings function is already doing its job. So that's great. So we can remove that from here, because now we will actually want the controller to run whenever we click one of the buttons in the recipe view. And so what we will do now is to create a new event listener in the recipe. So here in this recipe view. And again, that's because that's where these buttons already are. And so there's no need to create a new, like a servings view. So here I will simply create a new method, and as always it's called add_handler and then something. So here let's call it update servings to make its purpose really clear. And then as always the handler function. And again, that handler function will of course then be that controller that we just wrote here. Okay, now how will we actually do this? So the parent element here is this whole recipe, but the elements that we are interested in are these 2 buttons. So these buttons increase servings and button decrease servings. And the class that they have both in common is this button tiny, right? Now each of these buttons also has some elements inside of it. And so, yeah, the best way of doing this is actually once again doing event delegation. So we already have the parent element, and so we can listen for events on that one and then check if the click target was one of those buttons. And so this is actually going to be very similar to what we did in the last video with the pagination buttons. So add event listener, click, and then here again we want to actually select that button element that was clicked or not. So here we then use again event.target, which is the clicked element, and then once again we use the closest method, which is I think I've said it before, an amazing method, which is really, really useful for event delegation. And so again, we are looking for elements with the button tiny class. So button tiny And that is important because the user might click actually on this, on this SVG element instead of the button element itself. And so then that will basically look for the closest button tiny, right? But of course, if we're clicking outside of any of these buttons, then this closest will not return any element. It will return null. And so we need to check for that, just like before. So if no button, then return. But otherwise, let's simply, for now, log it to the console. And so now we need to connect this here with the controller. And so let's do that. So and let's actually do this here. So keep it close to the other recipe view. So recipe view.add handler update servings, which will then receive control servings so that it can execute our controller function. And so if we now put some value here, let's say 8, then that should actually already update the servings and re-render the recipe view. So let's see. Let's take a look here at this value and these values here. Oh, and nothing happened because, of course, we didn't call. So here we didn't call control recipes yet, right? So we didn't call the handler function. So let's actually do that. All right. And you see that the number here changed to 8, and here all the values changed as well. So that's great. Means again that our update servings function is doing its job, and the same can be said for control servings. Now we can also see that the correct button here was selected. Now it's actually not showing it anymore here, but that's probably because the DOM was re-rendered here. And so this new button is not exactly this button that we have here. But that doesn't really matter because all I wanted was to check if the selection was correct here. And it was. So let's try that again now with the increase button and watch again what happens with the ingredients. Okay. And so here we got the button increase servings. Okay. So we're almost done here. Now all we want to do is, of course, to decrease the value when we click here and increase the value when we click the plus button. And so we don't want to always set the value to 8, but instead do that dynamically. And there are multiple ways in which we can do that. So let's think about this a little bit. So we could do it right in the controller, because right here we already know what the current number of servings is. And so then here we could simply take that and decrease or increase that value by 1. And so that would then yield the effect that we want. However, I would like to keep this controller here as flexible and as robust as possible. And so I don't want this controller to be the one responsible for telling which should be the next serving, so the next number of servings. So that should come from the view and not from the controller, because it is in the view where the user is actually updating the servings. And so in order to keep this controller as flexible as possible, we can simply pass in basically the new servings and then pass that new servings into update servings. Okay, so new servings here, and then use that here as well. And so now we will determine this new servings in the view and pass that value then into this controller. All right. But now here in this function, how will we determine the new servings? Well, once again, here we will need to connect the user interface with the code. And as always, for that, we use the special data properties. So let's come to our button, or both our buttons, and then add a new property here. And so then we can read the value from that property in the add event listener function. So let's say data update 2. And then here the value should be the current servings and +1, right? Because this is the button to increase the servings. Well, actually both are called increase, but this one has a minus sign. So this icon here is called icon minus. So that means that we are decreasing the value. But anyway, what we want here is basically the current servings minus 1, right? And then in the other button, we want the same, but +1. So as I said in the beginning, this is pretty similar to the pagination buttons. And here let's actually change increase that we have in both to update. Okay, and let's then actually use this class to select the buttons, because button tiny is a class that is actually more about styling, and this button update servings is more about the functionality. So let's use that one here. And so now we can read, of course, that value. So const update 2 equals the button dot data set dot update 2. Right, so here update 2 as well, and it has this camel case here because when there is a dash in the property name, then that will be converted to a camel case notation like this. And here we can actually use the structuring, so that makes the code even cleaner. Then we can pass that value here to update 2, and that's it, right? Now here we just need to convert that to a number, but besides that, we should be good to go. So it should be working now. So instead of changing to the hard-coded value of 8 we had before, let's see what happens now. Oh, we get undefined servings. So let's try to understand what's happening. But at least the button here was correct. So the value used to be 4, and so the plus button that we clicked had the data update 2 set to 5. Okay, so here let's simply check the value of update 2. Maybe we did something wrong in getting that value. Yeah, it looks like that is undefined. So let's go back and check what's going on here. But it looks correct. So update 2 is not spelled wrong. Am I right? Update 2. And so, well, let's try to get rid of the destructuring, but that shouldn't be the cause. Update 2. Oh, and actually that should be the cause because of this conversion that we have here. So I was trying to convert plus a button data set and then trying to get update 2 from there. So I'm sure that now it will work, but let's see. And yes, it does. So now we get the number there. So beautiful. And you see the values changing down there. And everything works correctly. Now there's just this flickering of the image here, but we will take care of that in the next lecture. For now, let's experiment and see what happens here at a certain point. So here we reach 0 servings, and then we go even further down. And so this, of course, doesn't make any sense. So we need to add a check here. So basically, we only want to call the handler if the number we will update to is greater than 0. So we don't want to update to 0 or anything below. And so then, in that case, we simply don't call the handler. Okay. Now here, let's put it back to destructuring like we had it before. So I really prefer that. And then I will simply do the conversion from the string. So right now this is a string. So I will simply convert that here and also here. Can also get rid of this console.log here to make the function a bit cleaner. And so let's see again. So it keeps working here, but then as we reach 1, it doesn't go any further down. Okay, so beautiful, that works, but we're still using this kind of hack of updating the entire view here at once. So remember, here in the controller, in order to basically update the recipe view, we are simply rendering it all over again. And so that takes some time, especially noticeable here in the image. So you see, I think it's basically trying to download the image again. And so that means, of course, trouble. And so in the next lecture, we will develop a simple algorithm which will basically only update the DOM in places where we actually want to update the markup. So only, for example, this number here and these numbers, and leaving everything else the same. So without re-rendering everything. And that will be a lot of fun. And so let's go do that next.